Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast diving into one topic affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, today with Elana Kaminka, whose son, Yanai, was killed on October 7th, 2023, while defending the IDF Zikim base. Elana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
We are here for a rare, open discussion about why a bereaved family would continue on the path of peace and coexistence even after the killing of their own son on one of the biggest slaughterings of the Jewish people to date. So we are going to talk about all of that in an open, respectful way when we're back. Elana, thank you so much again for joining me today. I am Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Elana Kaminka. Elana, obviously, your son Yanai is more than just a statistic, more than just one of the many, many soldiers who fell on October 7th. I know you very peripherally. We haven't actually met until now because our children know each other. And I would like you to tell me about Yanai.
Sure. So Yanai is our eldest son, one of four, the eldest out of four. And I think Yanai was always a very classic oldest child. He felt a lot of responsibility on his shoulders, even though we tried to relieve him of that responsibility. And he thought a lot about leadership throughout his life. He didn't speak a lot. He kept his cards close, held his cards close, but he was very focused on other people and trying to understand other people, trying to figure them out. We used to say he has X-ray eyes because he was constantly analyzing people's body language, their eyes, their speech, and trying to understand them, trying to place himself in their mindset and to figure them out and how they think, and in that way work with them in an effective way. He also wrote a lot about his thoughts about leadership that he developed both as a guide in the Scouts movement in high school and then later in the Army. And when he was in officers training, he was asked to write his leadership values as a commander. And he listed several, but the top two were, first of all, to love your soldiers and to make them feel loved. It's not enough to love them, but they should feel that they're loved and cared for. And the second value he wrote was responsibility. And he wrote that every commander has complete responsibility for the people in their care, whether it's something that happens on base or something that happens at home. He saw himself as completely responsible for everything. And I think those two values really directed how he lived his life and how the choices he made, because they weren't just words to him. He understood very deeply that anyone can write words on a piece of paper, but if you want them to mean something, they have to translate into actions. And he translated those values into actions time and time again.
So Yanai fell at the IDF Zikim base, which is a base of the Home Front Command. And my daughter, coincidentally, who knows your other son, Liam, or one of your other sons, Liam, they went to school together, obviously. So in any case, my daughter is part of that unit as well. It's a search and rescue unit, a mixed male and female fighting unit whose job it is search and rescue. And your son, Yanai, was the lieutenant at the base, as I understand it. And he was in charge of these new recruits who had just recruited in August. My daughter conscripted a year later. In any case, he was in charge of these new recruits, and in reading some of the work that you've had published since Yanai's death, he treated them as his own children. And so this explains this philosophy, this principle of Yanai and the other officers on duty that day of protecting their babies, their children. That explains partially his death in a way. But how do you reconcile with that? Obviously, you mentioned his responsibility, his love of his soldiers, but did you ever expect that he would be giving up his life for these principles?
I never expected it. And I want to say that I don't think that it is absolutely unacceptable to me that that was the only choice that he had. I think we as Israelis, we like to romanticize death and the idea that it's good to die for your country. And I don't feel that way at all. I think that the best thing for Israel would have been for Yanai to continue to live and to contribute to his country because he had a lot to contribute. And the idea that our children have no choice but to give up their lives in order to save others is absolutely unacceptable to me. The young trainees who Yanai was in charge of had been in the army for 6 weeks. The higher-ups made a decision that they were capable of defending the borders of Israel and made the decisions to prioritize other areas and to leave only these young recruits in such a problematic place like in the Gaza border. When they were attacked at 6:29 in the morning, Yanai and the 4 other officers who were with them quickly made the decision and understood what their higher-ups didn't understand, that these new recruits simply didn't have the tools to handle such a complex situation. They had no idea how complex the situation was. They had no intelligence, no information, no idea what was happening in the other bases in their surroundings and in the kibbutzes. But just from what they could see and hear, they could see bombs falling, they could hear shooting, and they realized this wasn't a situation for new recruits who'd only been in the army for 6 weeks. And they gave a command that the commanders, the officers, and the sergeants would go out and take over all the guard posts for the new recruits. And that's what they did. Yanai first went to a post that faces the sea. He met a group of terrified civilians there who'd been at a party on the beach. And the first thing he did was bring them into the base and make sure they were safe and in a bomb shelter there. And then as the time progressed, they didn't have any kind of official communications. They were communicating on the staff WhatsApp group, group chat. And he started to get calls from his colleagues at the other posts that were desperate for reinforcements, desperate for help, and there was no one to help. And Yanai made the personal decision that he was going to move to another post and help his subordinates who were there. He evacuated one of his subordinates who'd been injured and came in, took over for her and fought alongside another officer, Adel Ben Simon, and 2 other sergeants until they were killed defending the post.
When Yanai entered the army, just like my daughter, just like my son, just like my other son, all soldiers who enter the army, especially in the fighting forces, they take an oath to defend even at the expense of their lives. You had to hear that oath 6 weeks later when your second son, Liam, also joined the army. He's now a paramedic, as far as I understand it from intelligence from my oldest son. And How did that feel when you heard him taking that oath?
So I first want to say that I took that oath myself. I grew up in the States and I moved to Israel at age 18 to serve in the army as a lone soldier. And for me, that gave me a great sense of pride. I believed in the ideals that Israel was created for. I believed that Israel was created as a state to be a safe haven for the Jewish people and to be a light among nations of humanity, of consideration, of compassion. And those were the values that I joined the army to serve. And when I took that oath, that was what I believed. I can tell you that the sense of pride that I had has been horribly eroded because I don't feel that the IDF is being led, the IDF and the country are being led by people who are motivated by the right motivations and are making the decisions that are really to the benefit of the people of Israel. And therefore, it's much more complicated now for me to see my children joining the army. I see that the Jewish value of life is not being prioritized, that other values are taking precedence over the value of life, whether it's the life of the hostages, the lives of the soldiers who are being sent into Gaza again and again in order to achieve to achieve goals that are completely unclear. It's not transparent to the Israeli public what the goals that the army is trying to achieve are. And putting your child's life in the hands of people that you don't feel that you can trust is a horrible feeling. I'll also say that in the past year and a half since Yanai was killed, I haven't seen a single member of the civilian leadership of the country. The army, yes, the military leadership has stood by our side, but I haven't seen a single member of Knesset, an assistant of a member of a Knesset. Nobody has come to look me in the eyes, to take any kind of responsibility for what happened to Yanai, and therefore putting my other children's lives in their hands it's horrifying. It's truly a sense of horror because I don't have any confidence and any faith in the decision makers that are leading Israel today.
And yet you have another son who is a paramedic, and you have a daughter, as I understand it, who is now in 12th grade and facing this tough crossroads as well. And do you foresee sending her into the arms of the army as well?
So you're a mother of teenagers like I am, and therefore you realize that at a certain point in their lives, it's no longer your decision. We do have deep discussions at home about On one hand, the fact that our children were raised with the ideal of commitment to the country, of service, that you don't shirk your responsibility, that it's important that every human being contribute to the state and give up themselves. And they believe in that, and it's the values that they received at home. On the other hand, it's not clear-cut, because when those values are being used in order to achieve goals that are not for the greater good, I'll choose my words very carefully, are not for the greater good, then it becomes much more complex. So my children, I raise them to be thinkers. I raise them to ask questions. We speak about the issues, we ask the questions, we have the discussions, but at the end of the day, it's their decision. It's not mine. They're adults and they choose their own paths.
Let's talk about the path that you've chosen from even before the October 7th massacre, and that is the path of conversation, the path of discussion, the path of seeing the other as a person. And initially, you weren't necessarily in this very terrible group of the Bereaved Families Forum, terrible because of the situation that led you to this group, not because of the group itself. But you were also active in other groups, Tag Ma'ir, explain what that is, and also other groups protesting against the government, the Netanyahu government. So let's start with Tag Ma'ir and what led you to this group.
Well, if I could actually take one step further back, I live in a town called Tzur Adasa. We moved here in 2000, and Tzur Adasa sits right on the Green Line. So we're within the 1948 borders of Israel, but we're really adjacent to the Green Line that separates us from the West Bank. And I believe very strongly that it's important to invest in the community that you live in and to be a good neighbor to the people that you live nearby, whether those are the people who live next door or the people who live in communities around me. And that it's often easier to solve things or to resolve problems on a local level than it is on a national level. Nationally, it's very hard. You don't know the people that are involved personally, and therefore it's much more difficult to find the ways to reach compromise. But on a local level, when you get to know people, a lot of things are easier to resolve. And I joined local groups, and through those local groups, I met my Palestinian neighbors, and I had never met Palestinians before. I think as Israelis, we read a lot of things and we hear a lot of things about who Palestinians are and what they believe and what they think. And when I started sitting down and speaking to them, what I realized is that most of what we're told isn't true. First of all, they're very different from one another. Just like we Israelis, there's huge differences of opinion within Israeli society on every topic, whether it's religion, whether it's politics, whether it's personal preferences. And the same is true in Palestinian society. You can grab 10 Palestinians and you'll hear 10 different opinions, just like you will with 10 Israelis. And also I started to understand more about the complexity of their life and the way that actions that we take as Israelis oftentimes unintentionally impact them. And that issue started to interest me, and I started to get to know more and more people and to read more. I'm a historian, and I started to study history and learn more about the different topics, and I discovered a whole new world. And it made me change my perspective and realize that there are millions of Palestinians and millions of Israelis living in the same land, and no one's going anywhere. And eventually, we're going to have to learn how to live together. And the question is only how many people are going to die in the process. And that led me to be active in groups like Tag Ma'ir. That Tag Ma'ir is actually a non-political organization that supports victims of any kind of violence, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and visits the victims of violence. So any Jewish victims of a terror attack, Tag Ma'ir comes and visits them. Muslims who face hate crimes by Jews, which is something that happens. Israelis don't like to admit it, but it happens, and it happens a lot. We visit them and support them. And also, like I mentioned, Christians. There have been many, many attacks recently on Christians in the Old City, the various churches by Jews who don't want Christians and churches in Jerusalem. And we've also supported the various Christian communities from a wide variety of countries and sects of Christianity.
One of the great picture moments, the great photo ops that Tag Meir does every year is on the Flag March, which is on Jerusalem Day in the Old City. The participants, the volunteers in Tag Meir, go out to the Old City and hand out flowers, apologizing before this very extremist march that goes through the Old City and can be quite, of course, distressing for any of the Muslim residents in the city or the shopkeepers. So, Elana, that is Tag Meir, and as you said, that's apolitical. But of late, before the October 7th massacre, we're talking more about during the judicial overhaul and potentially before, you also have become an activist against the government. What led you to that path?
So I very strongly believe that I've been very lucky to be in a solid and strong and happy marriage for 25 years. And I think when you live with another person, you realize that it can't be about one side getting what they want at the expense of the other. You're constantly in dialogue and you're constantly trying to understand your partner better so that you can be considerate of him or her. And in that way, he can be more considerate of you. And it's a constant dialogue and it's a constant calibration of understanding and getting into the other person's head and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I believe that the Middle East, to a certain degree, has had a lot of consideration. There's a lot of tension and there's a lot of anger from all sides. But in the end of the day, there's also a lot of things that maybe don't make the news in where people do work together and do manage to keep things calm even when they flare up. And when I saw this government come to power, it was clear to me that any of those checks and balances that kept things livable, that kept things in some kind of balance, were going to be thrown out of balance. I'm not an anxious person by nature. I was never the mom always calling kids to see who was coming home and where the kids were. But when this government came to power, I started having anxiety attacks. And I felt that we were in a car with our foot on the gas and we were barreling towards a cliff and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I didn't know what the cliff would look like, but I knew that when you allow the most extremist voices of any society to take over the dialogue, it leads to disaster. People speak a lot in this government about unity and how important unity is, but what you and I understood and what they don't seem to understand is that words are empty if you don't have anything that stands behind them. And you don't create unity by yelling unity. You create unity by bringing people together, by showing understanding for different groups, by connecting different groups and not creating incitement between the groups and tearing society apart. And when I saw the government begin to do things that did precisely that destroyed the unity of the solidarity of our country, I felt that I was fighting for my country and I felt I was fighting for my children's lives because I saw a disaster on the horizon. I never expected it would be Eyal losing his life, but I did have a deep intuition that something horrible was going to happen because when you tear society apart like that, it never leads to good places. Again, the historian in me right away saw reflections on the past, and there's been a Jewish state twice in history, and both times it was brought down when fanatic zealots took over who couldn't see past their own beliefs and desires, who weren't in dialogue with reality. And it led to the destruction of Israel 2 times before, and I couldn't sit quietly and let it happen again. I felt I had to speak out.
There are many of the other side, in this case, the far right, who believe that the leftist peaceniks are the zealots in this case, and that they're living in a dream, and obviously pointing to the 2005 disengagement in which Israel unilaterally left the Gaza Strip in order to create peace, ostensibly, and that just didn't work. We obviously saw the fruits of that play out before our very eyes less than 20 years later. What do you say to these people who say that you are living in the fantasy, that you are the person who is creating the divisiveness in this country?
I'll say 2 things. First of all, the left hasn't been in a position of power since 2001. So the people who've been leading the country since 2001 are not the left, and they haven't been making the decisions. So it seems ridiculous in my mind to blame somebody who hasn't held any power for 24 years, one. And secondly, I'll say, yes, the peace process did lead to terror attacks, and it wasn't successful the first time we tried. But we've been trying war for 100 years, and that also hasn't had any kind of great success. And the right-wing government, the most right-wing government Israel has ever seen, led to the slaughter of 1,200 Israelis in one day. And so in best case, I'll say we have two sides that haven't been successful. Both sides have had failures. And I think that the Jewish people have been outstanding throughout history with being really creative in a lot of different fields. We've been creative in science and in literature and in tech and in so many different ways, and in arts. And when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we have absolutely no creativity. And for that, yes, I do think that the people in power are the ones who are responsible for that lack of creativity. For 20 years, we've tried nothing new. We've been doing the same things over and over again. We've been taking out a leader of one terrorist organization or another, and lo and behold, 2 days later, he has a replacement, and it doesn't advance us at all. And Einstein said, if you keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, then you're not the smartest person in the world. And I think that that's the key. It's not working. Their solution isn't working. So let's be creative. Let's think out of the box. Let's try something new. Let's think about it in a new way and approach the problem so we can create in a different way so we can create a better future for our children.
Let's go to a short break, and then we'll discuss the Bereaved Families Forum. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Elana Kaminka, mother of Yanai, who fell on October 7th, and also of 3 other children for whom she is fighting for a better future. Now, Elana, let's turn to the Bereaved Families Forum. And this is a very controversial organization in Israel. Israel is a very stratified society. I'm not sure if our listeners in North America are aware of that. But for example, if you just look at the school system, Arab students study separately for the most part than Jewish students, and Jewish students study separately from religious students, religious Jews, and from ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's a very stratified society, and any kind of organization that brings any of the sides together is considered at times controversial. This organization, perhaps by far more than most. So explain, first of all, what is this forum?
So first of all, what I'll say is that it's not what the Israeli media makes it out to be. The Israeli media loves to say that it compares Hamas terrorists to fallen Israeli soldiers, and that's ridiculous. It's not what the organization is. The Bereaved Families Forum was started by bereaved families, by Jews and by Palestinians who lost close family members, and came out and said something that was very brave. They came out and said, violence is not the answer. Violence will never be the answer. And violence is always a cycle. One violent act leads to retribution, which leads to another retribution. And there is no end to that cycle unless we stop the violence. And people from both sides of the line, today, I think we're about 800 families, half Palestinian, half Israelis, who come together, and our motto is, it won't end until we speak. And we come together and we speak and we listen to one another. And everyone who's in the organization is committed to peaceful resolution and reconciliation, and to the idea that, again, nobody's going anywhere. We're all here to stay, and we have to learn how to live together. And the fact that that's the organization that people choose to attack, I think says a lot about the illness of our current society. Israelis love to speak about how Palestinian society needs to be de-radicalized. But here are Palestinians who are moderates, who are coming and saying, we're against violence. We're for dialogue. We're for reconciliation. And those are the voices that Israelis want to shut down. And I think that requires a lot of soul searching, why that is, why people feel so threatened by people who come and say, we want to learn how to live together.
You are angry, rightfully so. And many in your situation would turn the anger to the other, meaning Hamas is Palestinian, so all Palestinians are bad. This is a very simplistic equation. But in your situation, it appears to me that you're taking a different path, that you're diverting that anger into activism for a better future for your children, obviously, but mostly targeting it against the Israeli government, which, as we said, you are already an activist against prior to this massacre. What do you say to those who say to you, Elana, you're targeting the wrong people. The Palestinians are the evil ones. The Hamas were Palestinians. How do you square that circle in a way from Israelis, just random Israelis, very good-hearted Israelis, probably for the most part, who are saying to you, you are having coffee with the wrong people here?
So I want to answer on two levels. First of all, I never expected the Hamas to protect me and my children. It's a terrorist organization. I had zero expectations from them, but I did have expectations from my own government to protect me and my children. And we were abandoned by our government and continue to be abandoned for the last year and a half. Again, I want to reiterate this. I haven't seen a single member of the government come to sit in my house and to give me any kind of explanation for what happened to my son who died defending the state of Israel. And I'm completely transparent. I don't interest them. I'm not a factor in their decision-making. And I think that says an enormous amount. Again, I had zero expectations from Hamas, but I did have expectations from the people who were tasked with protecting me and protecting my children and have failed completely, utterly, and totally in that task. As far as the being upset with the wrong people, I want to give an answer with a personal anecdote. In 2018, I was part of Tag Me'il, and as part of Tag Me'il, I went to visit a family, a very special family, a couple named Yaakov Ra'abi and Aisha Ra'abi, who were traveling in the West Bank to home from a visit with their older daughter who was married. And they had their younger daughter, 8-year-old Rama, in the car with them as they were driving home on a Friday night. They drove by the settlement of Rechalim, and Jewish people came out of the yeshiva in Rechalim and threw huge stones, boulders really, at their car because they knew that the only people that would be driving on that road on Friday night were Palestinians. And Aisha, the mother of 9 children, was hit in the head by one of the stones and killed on the spot in front of her husband and 8-year-old daughter. 2 weeks after she was killed in October of 2018, I came as part of a Tag Me'il delegation to visit Yaakov, a group of Jews, some of whom had kippahs on their head. And Yaakov knew the Jews had just murdered his wife. He opened the door of his home. He welcomed us in with hugs, with care. He has the kindest eyes in the world. We brought an olive tree and planted it with his daughter in the yard of his home in memory of his wife. And I think if anyone has given me a personal example of how to behave with dignity and with love after a tragedy, it's Yaakov. Yaakov joined the Bereaved Families Forum immediately after Aisha's death because he wanted to speak out about peace. He believes in peace. He always says one of his daughters is named Salam, and he chose that name for her because he believes in peace. And before October 7th, he spent his days coming to speak to Israelis, to schools, to students, to community organizations about why he believes in a common future and why he wants to work with Jews to build that future. And it was clear to me after losing Yanai that I had to follow his example.
And yet your message is not very acceptable to some who are in charge of allowing who goes into schools and who does not. As I understand it, this year, in fact, or in the past, obviously, 19 months, you've been ejected from schools for trying to preach this compassion that you learned so difficultly.
So it's not me personally, it's the organization has been banned from schools. I actually speak a lot with schools, but the organization has been banned by the current Minister of Education. And that to me is really shocking because I'm, as you mentioned, the mother of 2 school children as well. And in the school system, they hear many opinions that I don't agree with. And you know what? That's fine. I'm happy that they hear different opinions. I think it's important that they hear different opinions so they can develop their own thoughts and their own mindset. And you don't do that unless you hear you're exposed to a wide range of ideas. And that's what teaches you how to think, how to be an independent thinker and to develop your own worldview. And I would never consider blocking people who think differently than me from speaking in the school system. The fact that our organization is being blocked, as far as I'm concerned, is the most un-Jewish thing that I can imagine, because Judaism in general developed and became a wealth of creativity and thought and intellect because it's all based on argument. You open up a page of Gemara and you see arguments. You see people sharing different opinions and not showing only one opinion and saying that's the only way to think. And that allowed the Jewish people to develop an extremely rich culture and to reach intellectual heights that I think are admired throughout the world. And blocking people from speaking and sharing different opinions is in my mind, extremely un-Jewish. And not only that, it hurts our society. We saw on October 7th that there was a consensus. There was an idea of that the Hamas was no longer a threat, and no one dared challenge that consensus. And it led to a tragedy. And when we teach our school children that there's only one way to think, and that if you think differently, your ideas have to be squelched, how are they going to develop that creative thinking, that ability to look at things from a different angle that will prevent future disasters? No one has to agree with me. I come into a school, I tell the kids, argue with me, disagree with me. I want to have those conversations, but at least listen to different opinions and then develop your own. That's a good thing. But squelching out different voices is a disaster for our country. And I think we saw part of that disaster on October 7th.
We saw it on October 7th. And of course, we see it on college campuses in our fatherland, the United States. We both made aliyah from there. Now, Elana, I just want to play a little bit more devil's advocate with what you were just saying, however. And as I understand it, it was MK Avi Maoz who was one of the leading voices to keep you out of the schools here in Israel. And Avi Maoz, of course, is the head of Noam, which is basically a one policy platform, which is anti-gay, essentially. And so would you want his activists to come into your children's schools, which happen to be also my children's schools? Would you want them to come into our schools and preach this hatred, this anti-gay message as just another voice, another Jewish voice?
So I think that as long as it's balanced with other opinions, I think you have to give as long as people aren't preaching violence. I would say violence is where I draw the line. If people were preaching, or people like Avi Maoz were advocating violence against gay people, I would say that shouldn't be allowed. But anybody that isn't speaking about violence, I think should be let in. But you have to show a wide variety. You have to expose kids to a wide variety of different opinions and also give them the tools to assess those opinions, to think about them, to read background information before you hear speakers. And I think as long as kids get a wide variety of ideas and are exposed to a wide variety of ideas, they're smart enough to identify baseless hatred when they see it. Even if they hear Avi Maoz, they'll realize that that's not who they are or the type of person that they want to be. I give them a lot of credit. But we have to at least allow them the exposure. And I think schools are very important because today, as we all know, kids are mostly exposed to ideas by social media. And social media algorithms have an incentive to show them only the most extreme content in short bursts without some of the complexity and depth that you get from speaking to someone and asking questions and having a chance to actually have dialogue rather than just being passive observers. And that's a problem worldwide, of course, not only in Israel. But we can try and at least give a fight in our schools by teaching them other ways of approaching problems. And that starts by speaking with people with different opinions, challenging those opinions, learning how to argue respectfully, and learning how to be deep thinkers.
The whole basis of the state of Israel, the Jewish state, is exclusionary in a way. And you and I signed up to onto it when we made aliyah and decided that this is where we're going to stake our pegs for our tent, for our lives, for our children's lives, potentially, hopefully. I definitely want my children to stay here. And how do you reconcile that now that you're reaching out to, not now, you've been for a long time, but in the course of reaching out to the other people who wants this land as much as we do? How do you reconcile this conflict? Because I understand you're a Zionist, you want to remain here in Israel. I mean, you could easily have gone back to the United States yourself. How do you reconcile this Jewish state in the course of your coexistence work?
So the Jewish state was created, as I said at the beginning, for two purposes, both to be a safe haven for the Jewish people and a light among nations. And you can't have one without the other. And I think we've neglected one side. And by neglecting one side, it's also hurt the other side. We're much less safe of a haven because we've forgotten some of our morality and we've forgotten some of our humanity. And in the end of the day, that hurts us more than it hurts anyone else. I'm very much a practical person. I like to look at things on a very practical way. And on a practical level, there are millions of Palestinians here and millions of Israelis here, and nobody's going anywhere. And the idea that we, as basically similar numbers of Palestinians and Israelis, that the Israelis can keep the Palestinians under harsh military control forever. not until as we're undergoing a process to create a political solution, but that we're going to have a military occupation forever, and that it's not going to take a huge price from us. I'm looking at I'm looking at it from a very egotistical perspective. The fact that if we do what the government wants to now and reoccupy Gaza, that means that all of our spouses, all of our children are going to spend most of their life in reserve duty. A lot of them are going to lose their lives. The economy is going to be devastated because they're going to be in reserve duty rather than doing activity that spurs the economy on. At the end of the day, there won't be money to pay for an endless occupation, and there won't be enough soldiers to fight for an endless occupation. When I sat in the investigation for the battle at my son's base, one of the conclusions that the military made was that they need more soldiers in that area. And I asked the general, where are those soldiers going to come from? Again, the strategy is a forever war in Gaza, a forever war in the West Bank. You need soldiers protecting the northern border, protecting the southern border. The blanket is too short. You pull it in one direction, you expose another area. So maybe the next October 7th won't be in the Gaza envelope, but it'll be somewhere else because there simply aren't enough resources to implement what this government wants to do. There aren't. It's not even ideological. It's mathematic. There aren't enough people and there isn't enough money. You have to deal with reality. And reality is that there are people who live here and we have to find a way to live with them. I don't believe in a solution. People always ask me, what's the solution? And I always come back and say, what's the solution for the economy? There isn't one. If someone could figure out the perfect interest rate, that if we just had that interest rate, then we'd have a great economy all the time. It doesn't work that way. You adjust the interest rate because inflation goes up because of something, a natural disaster or something else, a pandemic, something that's not related. So you have to play around with the inflation, with the rates of interest in order to manage the inflation. And that causes a different problem. You're constantly working on finessing it and juggling it to try and manage the situation in the best way possible. And I believe that living together is the same way. There's constantly issues that come up, and we have to be smart about managing them in a way that recognizes that both sides have legitimate requirements and legitimate needs. And I think we as Israelis are not very honest with ourselves about how we relate to Palestinians and what it's like for Palestinians to live under our control. I think if we were more honest with ourselves and actually really tried to understand what it's like to live as a Palestinian, we'd be much better at managing the conflict for ourselves. And that's the work that we have to do for our own benefit. We owe it to ourselves because what's going on now is simply untenable, like I said, mathematically, if not any other way.
Elana, so much food for thought. Thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Thank you. And I want to finish off with something that in Israel after October 7th, there were signs put up all over the country that say, together we'll win. And those signs were really painful for me to see because, as I mentioned before, I don't feel the togetherness. I hear the words, but the people who are saying those words haven't been at my side for the last year and a half. I haven't seen them once. And as far as winning, I'm not going to win. I lost my child and I will never win. And I don't even understand what winning is, what it means other than an empty slogan. Every time I would see those signs, I'd kind of feel my heart skip a beat until I decided to see the words differently. And the fact is that right now, both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people are losing big time, without question, on both sides. And if we ever win, I think it'll be together that we'll win. Palestinians and Israelis who will learn to live together in a society that can benefit us both.
Elana, thank you for that last thought. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcasts@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.